Ba, 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 ba.
Good day and welcome. I'm Joey, and this is Orange 20. Today we're going to talk about planning your first session after you've completed your session 0. You can see that video here if I figure out how to YouTube. I will talk more about planning your first campaign in a later episode, but today I want to talk about that very first game where everybody comes ready to play. If you completed your session 0, you have a lot of information to work with to plan that game. You probably have an idea of what you wanted the first game to be before you started that session. You knew Yaltar the Wise had not been heard from in weeks, and his friend, the retired fighter Gavin, who runs the Shattered Shield Tavern, was going to be hiring adventurers to go to his tower and see what had happened. In fact, in session 0, you told your players this, and asked them to make characters who would look into this for Gavin. So when you start planning your adventure, you don't just need a Gavin hiring whomever happens to come into his tavern for this mission. You know that Gavin's daughter Maris, who followed in his footsteps as a fighter, Vittlewick, Yaltar's estranged wizard apprentice, Vittlewick's childhood friend Podwin, a traveling bard always seeking new lore, and Horwal, a cleric of Mystera, who has been working with Vittlewick for months, will all be going on this adventure. Now Gavin isn't just hiring random strangers. He's recruiting his daughter and his friend's apprentice for help. Horwal and Podwin are interested in learning more and meeting Vittlewick's teacher. The tone is very different. Your game became personal, and the stakes are built right in. So in this case, Gavin suddenly becomes wealthier in my mind. No matter what, he was going to offer 200 gold to a party of 4 to investigate. But the situation has now changed. It's become, for your trouble, not, this is what I can scrape together, oh mysterious strangers. Please, you must help me. Next, as you design your adventure, you can look at who the characters are. The party I described above is pretty mystically oriented. There is a fighter, but these characters strike me more as investigators. I would put in more puzzles, secret doors, and strange creatures whom can be reasoned with, if you can understand and uncover their otherworldly wants. Remember, the decisions characters made at creation are their votes for what they want to see in the game. Before you start writing your adventure, you should take a look at their sheets. Any place where you see at least 2 characters took a skill, put some problem in the first adventure that can be solved with that skill. I changed this adventure significantly based on the party makeup. If I ended up with a warlock, a rogue, a ranger, and a monk, I start adding more traps. The monsters I put in tend to be bigger, more challenging monsters that have some weakness to be exploited, or they can be entirely avoided. This has a lot to do with how I perceive these classes. So if I look at the group and they seem more combat heavy, then the trip to the tower is through more dangerous country, and the issues at the tower can be solved with a sharp axe and a stout back. Part of my thinking is Gavin, though retired, is an experienced adventurer. He's hiring a team that he thinks will succeed. You know the team he's hiring. So even though this logic may seem a bit backwards, these are going to be the heroes of the story, so they have to be the heroes who will succeed in the story. Of course, this does depend on playstyles. There's a good section on the different playstyles in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 38. Most D&D, I would say, tends to fall under the heroic fantasy style depicted in there. It goes on to describe other styles, like the Conan-inspired Sandals and Sorceries, or Sword and Sorceries, dark fantasy, wushu, a bunch of other different types. Wushu. Is that how you say it? I never know. And while you can certainly run other styles of games than heroic fantasy with D&D, I tend to recommend using different systems designed from the ground up for those styles. Even though all the rules are there and work, I would probably never tell a samurai-inspired story with D&D. Not when I have Legends of the Five Rings. A game system makes certain assumptions about how it will be played, how the world works, and how things happen in that world. when you try to take a game like D&D, which, while it is pretty broad and covers a lot of genres, and try and adapt it to a different game style, you're not getting away from some of those base assumptions. When you want to play superheroes, D&D assumes a different base power level, and you can massage those rules, especially with higher level characters, but you don't actually capture what that genre is emulating. If you want to play a modern game, we don't think of modern stories in the same way we do D&D. In a fantasy story, we picture the heroes getting stronger over time, gaining levels. If you watch a modern setting, if you watch like a police procedural or even something like the X-Files, you don't get the sense that the characters have become that much better at their job. So you want something that emulates that system where it's more about what they know than how good they are at the things they know. And now they're just solving problems with the skills they've had since before the series started. You want to showcase whatever the game you're running is best at. With D&D, you get to be an awesome fantasy hero. Especially with brand new players, their first fight or two should show how cool they are and let them play with their abilities without really risking their characters. I generally put in a few easy encounters as the first one or two. So, on the way to the tower, a couple of goblins try to rob the group. The goblins have chosen poorly. Looking at the CRs for monsters, I might put a couple of flying swords attached to the front door of the tower, which is interesting, but shouldn't be too hard for starting characters to beat. It gives them another chance to try out their new powers. At the end of the first adventure, you'll want to put in some kind of boss. One of the things I like to recommend is don't wait too long in D&D to show them their first dragon. After all, it's not Dungeons and Goblin bosses. The Wyrmlings are all a pretty low challenge rating, and if they turn out to be too much for a new group, wait until some member of the party scores a hit, and have the dragon run off, easily scared and not used to pain. But he will be back. Oh yes, he will be back. On top of whatever they were offered to undertake the adventure in the first place, make sure there's a big old pile of treasure, worth more than the wages they were offered in the start. You want to make sure it's something they understand that they can plunder. You want to reinforce that by taking these jobs and going into dungeons, they're going to be richer than if they try and work outside in the world in a normal fashion. If you're running a different game, highlight whatever that game is best at. So if I'm running Call of Cthulhu, excuse me, then I highlight what that game's best at. I make sure I've got handouts so that the players can scour over old newspaper articles and diary entries from Mad Men. The monster is very deadly, especially if the characters haven't done their research. Make sure you telegraph this. Someone went in before them without the flute of Azul Tegar, and show them what happens if they don't find the monster's weakness. You should always include a trip to the sanitarium to see an investigator that the monster drove crazy. If I'm running Legend of the Five Rings, I quickly establish that characters are not seeking gold, but honor. There will be some scenes showing how important courtly prestige is and the power that that can bring. Generally, I'll throw in a formal duel, likely to the death, to show how serious a minor insult can be. Likely this will be between two NPCs, unless I am certain that the player can win that duel. It's one of the best mechanical items in that system, and I want to make sure that players know how interesting it is to duel so that they get excited the next time the possibility or threat of a duel comes up. You're using the first game to show your players the world and how they can expect to interact with it, while also trying to generate excitement. A word of warning. If you are dealing with experienced players, you can start by breaking their expectations right from the very beginning. But part of the thing is, experienced players have those expectations. If you're looking to play a Dark Souls-inspired slog through a dreary world with endless impossible monsters, but you tell your players, experienced or not, that you're running a standard game of D&D, they're going to be quickly disappointed with you in a lot of cases. A fighter expects to be able to mow through at least a few low-level mooks. A wizard expects to get off more than a single spell that actually accomplishes something. I mean, what year is this? 1988? Wizards get more than one spell a day. Part of running a good game is properly setting the expectations. It may seem like a lot of fun to tell people you're running a high-adventure game when you're actually planning on pulling the rug out from under them and running a desperate horror game. If you are going to do that, you really need to know your players. You need to know that they like both styles of play. When you invite people to your table for a game and tell them what to expect, they expect it. So, if you don't provide that, you run the risk of seriously disappointing people generous enough with their time to grant you a few hours to entertain them. Meanwhile, if you say, I want to run a game that starts out looking like a standard Lord of the Rings inspired fantasy game, but quickly it turns into a dark Conan type story with evil wizards casting spells that have gone terribly wrong. You aren't giving away too much of your plot. You're telling your players what they need to know to decide if they want to play that game, and maybe their characters will be surprised at the change, but if your players don't enjoy the first game, they might not come back for the second. If you're comfortable enough as a game master, one of my favorite questions to ask player is, what would you like to see in the game? Some players will present you with a plot line. My character wants to find her long-lost father. Some will have item requests. I really want to get that Hammer of Thunderbolts, Gauntlet of Ogre Strength, Belt of Giant kind combo. Some players will request for particular opponents to show up. I want to fight a beholder before the game is done. Now, a lot of this won't fit into session 1. A lot of this goes into long-term campaign planning. But they might have something that you can do at low levels. You can also start planting the seeds. By the end of session 1, you want to have some adventure hooks in there. Maybe in Yaltar's Tower, there's a letter from the long-lost father. Maybe there's a receipt from his sale of bracers of ogre strength to an auction house in Taladenia. Maybe you see the green dragon Wormling fly off to the east, warning he's going to go tell his mummy what you did, and she will be back. Maybe there's signs that someone tampered with the apparatus mysterium in Yaltar's lab, and there's a snag of a cloak, dark brown lined with red satin on the inside. You'll notice some of these are active hooks. You can go to Taladenia to see if you can still find the bracers, or find where the letter from Dad came from and head there. Others are more about foreshadowing. The Wormling may raid again with minions, or his mother may start attacking the area to later spur on the actions of characters and make the world seem more real when those events start happening. I wouldn't wait too long before they catch a glimpse of the mysterious gnome with a rip in his dark brown cloak lined with red satin, or the players will forget that happened in the first game. They'll forget why it was important. Maybe they need to deal with him right away, or maybe they can't yet, but they know he was responsible for Yaltar's lab exploding and attracting the Wormling. You just want to make sure that the pieces keep moving forward, but if you put in foreshadowing very early, you need to circle back to it so that people will understand that this remains important. Otherwise, it's 2 months later and you're saying, you see a gnome with a ripped cloak, and everyone will say, oh, why do we care? Don't worry if it feels too early for a requested magic item or an enemy seems too big to introduce. It can take a long time to resolve that story, long enough for characters to level to where that's appropriate. Maybe it takes months of travel for Maris to track down those bracers, and when she finds the person with them, the asking price is too high. but he does have an old crypt he needs cleared. Vittlewick can have a long rivalry with the gnome in brown, who keeps showing up just before tragedy strikes. Who is he, and why is he always there? The dragon known as the Emerald Storm continues harassing the countryside, asking for those who hurt her baby, and players wisely don't admit to know she's looking for them. Hopefully, that gives you some ideas on how to start your first adventure. If you have any questions for me, leave a comment below. Like and subscribe. And if you'd really like to give me money, I'll give you a link to a book you can buy. This book, the book I wrote. I'll give you the link in the description.
Ba 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 ba.
Looks good. Thanks to Ashley and Eric, who suggested I move the camera so I don't have to stop eating donuts.